So my name is Jill Cirasella. I am the Associate Librarian for Public Services and Scholarly Communication here at the Graduate Center. And I have made it a mini expertise to keep myself up on developments and controversies in open access. Today's presentation is called Open Access to Scholarly Literature, Which Side Are You On? And I'll explain shortly why it's dividing the world into halves. But so you don't feel like you need to take any notes, if you go to tinyurl.com/OA which side, you can see all of the slides from today. And you'll notice that I marked it with a Creative Commons license, CC BY, so you're welcome to use, reuse, remix these slides in any way. So as you may be aware, this is the first event in the Information Interventions at CUNY series, which was created by the CUNY Scholarly Communications Roundtable and is being co-sponsored by Just Publics at 365. And we're having a series of 4 events this year. So the first one is today. November 15th is Predatory Publishers and Conferences. And in the spring, we're going to have an event on open educational resources, which is just a fancy way of saying open access textbooks. And then we're also going to have a panel about the controversy surrounding open access and dissertations. Scholarly publishing then. Until reasonably recently, communicating through scholarly journals was slow, difficult, and expensive. It required a lot of time for typesetting and formatting, a lot of money for mailing, and a lot of work to attract and reach readers. Publishers added a lot of value to the scholarly communication system by taking care of these difficult, expensive, and time-intensive tasks. These days, journals look more like this: online, stored and transmitted inexpensively, formatted quickly and easily, often by the authors themselves, with a readership brought in by Google and other tools. What was once difficult and costly is now easy and inexpensive. Do journal prices reflect this? Well, for the most part, no. So the old-fashioned system of paying dearly to commercial scholarly publishers is needlessly expensive, very much outmoded, and seriously suboptimal. And it's often exploitative too. The only reason the old system is not obsolete is because we're letting it continue. The system needs to change, and we're all capable of changing it. So the point of publishing was always to get the information out to the public. Historically, we have used the best technology that we've had available to us, but that's not the case anymore. In fact, I'd argue that adhering to traditional publishing practices now, when we have today's inexpensive technologies, perverts the meaning of the word publish. So we need to start again using the best technology and distribution techniques available to us. So another way of putting all of that is this.
Congratulations, your manuscript has been accepted by the journal I own. Just sign here.
What is this? It grants you the copyright to my manuscript.
Yes. I'm a for-profit publisher, and this is my copyright form. Sign here.
Why do you need the copyright to my article?
So no one else can publish it. Sign here.
Could we just put all the articles on the internet for anyone to download for free?
No, I want universities and others to pay me for your article.
How much is my royalty share?
Your royalty share will be 0%.
Okay, how about a flat payment to me of $500?
How about 0?
How much money will the researchers get who reviewed my article?
They will get 0.
Taxpayers paid for my research. Then other researchers donated their time to assess my article. Now if I give you the copyright, you must be paid dozens of dollars per article, or thousands for a library subscription?
Yes. That is correct. Sign here.
How much profit will you make from my article?
Our expenses are low. Our operating profit margin is over 30%. Thank you for your work. Thank you to the reviewers. Thank you. Sign here.
Do you think it's right for student-funded and government-funded research to be locked behind paywalls?
I am a publisher, not an ethicist. Please give me the copyright to your article. I will sell it many times, and I will buy a house on the beach.
You said you already have a house on the beach.
Yes. I like to buy houses on the beach. Sign here.
There is an alternative to you, called open access journals. All articles in them are free to download.
Open access journals are a dangerous threat to our venerable journal system. Okay, give me $1,500 and I will make your specific article free.
What about all the other articles in the journal?
Don't worry, they will not be free. so libraries still will have to pay for a subscription. My operating profit margin will remain high.
If I publish in an open access journal, I will be helping make lots of articles free. If I deposit the final draft of articles in my university's digital repository, anyone can download them, and that will reduce your ability to charge large subscription fees.
Sign here.
So let's break down that insanity a little bit more carefully. University money, which generally consists of taxpayer money, tuition money, and other forms of funds, combined with grant money, that money altogether pays faculty to do research and record the results in articles. And then faculty give the articles and their copyright to publishers for free, and other researchers peer review for free. And then university libraries, the same universities where all of these people work, pay dearly for access to those articles. So publishers get the articles, they get the copyrights, and they get the labor for free. And then they rake in all of the money, and it is very, very big money, mostly collected from nonprofit institutions. So these incredibly highly profitable companies are doing this on the backs of nonprofit institutions. And then still, many students, researchers, and others can't access the articles they need. This slide has the same message. I just thought I was going to illustrate it in an additional way to get across the idea that there are some really sticky, strangling tentacles in the world of commercial scholarly publishing. So here are the average 2000 prices for various scientific disciplines. These are not maximum prices. These are not examples pulled out for their outrageousness. These are average prices. So the most outrageous, and I'll talk a little bit more about chemistry later on, is chemistry, where the average title is over $4,000 a year. And keep in mind the way these subscriptions work now, it's not that you pay $4,000 a year and then the library owns it. No, they only have access to it as long as they're paying for it. So if I pay for last year and then need to cancel my subscription, I don't have last year anymore. So the prices are really quite outrageous, mostly in the sciences. And journal prices are also increasing at an alarming rate, straining academic library budgets. So from 1986 to 2009, which is the most recent chart I could get open access, serial expenditures at research libraries increased by 381%. I had to make this too small to read just to be able to include the top of this chart. So monograph expenditures went up 77%, a much more reasonable increase. And then serial expenditures zoomed up, and they're continuing to go up. So, as we heard, I like to buy houses on the beach. So look at these profit margins. This is not revenue, this is profit margins. The bars that are in red show commercial scholarly publishers. And so we have Springer, Elsevier, Teller and Francis, etc. Notice that Springer and Elsevier, their profit margins are higher than Google, they're higher than Disney, they're higher than Apple. I investigated a little further, that's higher than the NFL. Their profit margins are really incredible. And this is slightly old, and the profit margins are not going down at all. In fact, Elsevier in 2012, their profit margin was up to 38%. So we, as academic institutions, we pay for these subscriptions, and 38 cents out of every dollar is just pure profit going into their pockets, when remember, we gave them all of that content and all of that labor for free. So journal publishing is of course not cost-free. I'm not trying to claim that it is. But too many publishers, especially commercial publishers, charge fees that are not justified by the cost of journal production and hosting. These publishers may make noble-sounding claims about their commitment to the broad dissemination of information, but make no mistake. They are fettering, not facilitating, scholarly communication and the spread of knowledge. For example, take this line from Elsevier's mission statement. Elsevier disseminates and preserves STM literature to meet the information needs of the world's present and future scientists and clinicians, linking thinkers with ideas. To which I say, bullshit. Their entire business is based on putting very large barriers between thinkers and ideas and then demanding far more money than is actually necessary to allow access. So don't take my word for it. As you can tell, I have some opinions on the matter, but much cooler heads are saying much the same thing. And this is what The Economist has to say on the matter. Publishing obscure academic journals is that rare thing in the media industry, a license to print money. And I ask, why are we, the producers of journal content, allowing publishers to turn our work into a license to print money? I doubt that many of us in this room want our work to be used in that way. And so for that reason and all the others I mentioned, we have a major problem on our hands. So what is the solution? The solution to the expensive, inefficient, inside-out and upside-down system I described is open access to scholarly journal articles and other scholarly materials. So of course, now I should define open access. The two key components of open access works are that they are accessible at no cost on a journal website or in a repository committed to long-term archiving, and they are available for all to read and use, but of course not plagiarize. So the situation is most ridiculous in commercial scholarly publishing, journal publishing. So that's my focus, but don't take that to mean that journals are the only kinds of things that can be open access. Other things that can be open access include textbooks and other kinds of books, data sets, dissertations, instructional modules, conference presentations, and much more. And also my background is science, and the pricing tends to be the most outrageous in the sciences, so you might notice that I have a bit of a focus on science journals, but open access is by no means only a scientific movement. Access to scholarly works is an issue that crosses all disciplines. How can we achieve open access? Suppose we all think it's a good idea, how can we get to it? There are two ways. The first is what's known as gold open access. Gold open access is when an author publishes his or her work with a publisher that automatically and immediately makes the work available online at no cost. Most gold open access publishers are journal publishers such as the Public Library of Science and Biomed Central, but book publishers do exist that make some or all of their books gold open access. For example, Amherst College is in the process of creating an academic book press that will exclusively publish open access books. So there's a lot to be said about gold open access, and I'll come back to it, but let's talk about the other form of open access first, which is called green open access. And green open access refers to materials that, regardless of where else they appear, are made available at no charge in an online open access repository committed to long-term preservation. So individual journals are called green open access journals, not if they themselves make the articles open access. They're subscription-based journals, but they allow authors to self-archive their articles in open access repositories, such as a repository dedicated to a specific discipline or a repository associated with the university. There's a lot to be said about that too, but we'll come back to it after we talk a little bit about finding open access materials. So as we covered, open access materials are freely available online, either on open access journal websites or in some kind of open access repository. And this means that open access articles are easily findable via Google, Google Scholar, and other web search tools. You'll find open access materials naturally when you do your research. Before I go any further, I want to try to convince you that open access is really a very good and very important thing that benefits just about everyone. And I really struggled with this. Did I want to give you all of the facts about open access first, or did I want to do the cheerleading first? And I decided I'm going to do the cheerleading first, because I want to make you interested in open access before I ask you to do the work of absorbing the facts. So if it sounds like I'm just being really biased and political, just know to bear with me, because I'll get to all of the facts shortly. So, who benefits? Well, most obviously, readers benefit. When materials are open access, more content is available to everyone, whether or not they're affiliated with a wealthy institution and whether or not they can personally afford to pay. And a special subcategory of readers, of course, is students. Open access ensures that students have access to the literature they need to master their fields no matter what college or university they attend, including cash-strapped universities like CUNY. Authors benefit as well. It might not seem immediately obvious, but I do want to get across that open access, while it is altruistic, it is not merely altruistic. So when researchers' articles are freely available online, many more people find the articles and read them, which leads to more citations and other scholarly articles and thus more impact in the field. Also, when articles are freely available online, they're easy to link to, which means they get mentioned more in popular articles, on blogs, on Twitter, etc., and that leads to greater impact, not just within the field, but also a greater awareness in the broader world. And we see this a lot. There's a lot of open access scientific articles, especially, that are linked to directly by the New York Times. It's much easier for the popular publications to summarize important findings if those findings were in open access journals. So I've heard some researchers express concern about losing control of their articles if they're open access, but actually open access gives authors more control over their work. When working with gold or green open access publishers, authors don't have to sign over all of their copyrights to the publisher. That was one of the worst parts of the broken system. Since they don't have to sign over their full copyrights, these authors cannot be forbidden from copying and sharing their own articles. And with non-open access journals, that prohibition is alarmingly common. With traditional journals, it was often the case that once you published your article with them, you had no more rights to your article than anybody else would. So you couldn't even make copies of your article to hand out to your students or colleagues. Or if you did, you were officially in violation of the policy. Furthermore, some people express concern about open access making plagiarism easier. And to that I say no. Open access makes plagiarism easier to detect. If a work is online and time-stamped, it's very easy to prove if it's been plagiarized by another work. And here's a dirty secret. My master's thesis was plagiarized by somebody here at the Graduate Center, but because it was online and time-stamped, I was able to prove it. And the person had defended, but the degree was never granted.
The degree what?
Was never granted. Yeah. And when I reported it, one of the very first things I said, well, how can we be sure? How can I be sure that you didn't plagiarize him? And I said, well, mine's been online ever since I graduated. Oh, so plagiarism is generally an act of desperation. People who need to plagiarize for whatever reason will go ahead and do so, regardless of the format of the original work. But if that original work is closed access, it's actually going to make it easier for somebody to get away with that plagiarism. So I really don't want people to be concerned about the effect of open access on plagiarism. You may have heard of the Colbert bump, which Stephen Colbert defines as the curious phenomenon whereby anyone who appears on this program gets a huge boost in popularity. So just as the Colbert report, which they showed to be true, boosts the popularity of guests, open access boosts the impact of articles. I mentioned that before, that articles, when they're easier to access, are more likely to be read, and when they're more likely to be read, they're more likely to be cited. And that open access advantage makes intuitive sense, but it's also been studied. Here are the titles of 2 articles that have studied the open access advantage, and then there's a link if you want to go to my slides later on. To a full bibliography of articles on that topic, and you'll notice the 2 that I mentioned here are kind of old. There have been many newer articles continuing to look at it and continuing to show that it exists. I just list these 2 because these were 2 of the earliest and most important ones. And the second one, comparing the impact of open access versus non-open access articles in the same journals, is especially interesting because instead of comparing this open access journal with this non-open access journal, it looks at journals that have both open access articles and non-open access articles. And it showed that within the same issue of the journal, the articles that were open access get cited more. So all of my recent works are open access. I'm the first to admit that they are of very minor importance. They're not going to save lives. They're not going to save the environment. They're just some articles on some very specific library topics, but they're all open access and what's happened as a result. They've had what I strongly believe are more readers. I know this because of stats I get from repositories. They've been shared in blog posts and tweets. They've gotten publicity. They've been included in course syllabi. I've gotten emails from strangers across the world. One of my favorite, I printed it out and hung it in my office because it warms my heart, was the one that says, "Dear Sir, thank you for writing your article." And I thought that's so great. There's somebody clearly doesn't know that Jill is a woman's name and wrote me anyway. And it's led to invitations to write and to talk. And the satisfaction of having my work read and appreciated. And without a doubt, this is all because the articles were open access. So moving on, readers benefit, authors benefit. Of course, there are also benefits of open access for libraries. When open access becomes sufficiently prevalent, libraries will no longer be hamstrung by the extremely high journal prices we discussed earlier. We're not there yet. It's going to take quite a while before this can happen, but it can happen. And it's not just the libraries that benefit at academic institutions. It's the entire college and university. When articles are open access, institutions don't have to pay twice for the research. They don't have to pay the researchers' salaries and the subscriptions to journals that publish the findings. And in the case of public institutions like CUNY, the tax-paying public doesn't need to pay 3 times for the research. Once for the researchers' salaries, twice for the research grants, and 3rd time for the subscriptions to the journals. Moreover, disciplines or fields of studies benefit. Greater access to information in a given field leads to more fully informed research in that field, which leads to better research in that field. There are several harrowing examples of medical research where people did not go back and find the more difficult to access articles, and those difficult to access articles would have told them that the side effects that they found and led to deaths in their studies had already been observed. And also, many authors place their articles in repositories before they appear in journals. That ends reliance on journal publication cycles, where there's often a backlog of a year or two after an article's been accepted before it gets published. And so ending the reliance on that cycle allows other researchers to respond to and build on the research more quickly, and that speeds innovation. And in the sciences, I totally know that that's true. My field was computer science and logic, and it's definitely the case that articles that got posted on archive.org, there would be subsequent articles and response articles long before the articles were officially published. Finally, and you might think that this is a little pie in the sky, but finally, the public or the world at large benefits from open access. Greater access to information leads to better informed doctors, teachers, journalists, etc., which leads to better informed individuals and voters, and a healthier, better educated people, leaving a cleaner, safer, more evidence-based world. So really, everybody benefits. Just about the only people who don't benefit are the commercial publishers. But I really don't think that we have to worry about their fate. So, putting all of what I just said differently, closed access means people die, as said by chemist Peter Murray Rust. Okay, if that sounds a little too apocalyptic, let me read a little bit more from his essay on it. He says, if a doctor, a patient, a planner, an engineer cannot read the appropriate literature, then they make suboptimal decisions, and that means people die. So the balance is, if we want a closed access publishing system, then we have to accept that the price is people's lives. But the publishers say that everybody who needs access to research articles already has access. Basically, they're saying that only researchers at well-funded universities and hospitals need access to the research. To which I say, oh, really? What about patients, high school students, college and graduate school alumni, independent researchers, citizen scientists, etc.? Don't they need access? Well, let's consider the case of Jack Andraka. He made a lot of headlines recently, so you might have heard of him already. He's a high school student who developed a test for pancreatic cancer that is cheaper, faster, and more accurate by a lot than any other test. His development was possible only because so much medical research is available open access on the PubMed Central site. So no, it is not the case that the only researchers, the only people who can make important contributions, are those at institutions where there are subscriptions. That was about open access more generally. Now I'm going to switch gears and talk about gold open access. And just as a reminder, gold open access are the open access journals, the things that are born open access. The publisher makes them open access. So there are a lot of questions about the respectability of open access journals. And part of that is because people sometimes confuse what exactly open means in open access journals. So always remember, this is my favorite little equation. Open access means anyone can read the journal. Open access does not mean that anyone can publish in the journal. Open access journals are real journals. Publishing in an open access journal is not self-publishing or vanity publishing. And open access journals, of course, they need to earn their respectability. And they earn them in the same way that other journals do, through the quality of the articles they publish and the prominence of the people they attract as authors and editors. And so, of course, yes, just as some non-open access journals are better than others, some open access journals are better than others. So before submitting an article to any journal, open access or not open access, you have to research its quality. A journal's peer review practices are entirely independent of its openness. Most scholarly journals, open access and subscription-based, are indeed peer-reviewed. True, some open access journals are not peer-reviewed rigorously or not peer-reviewed at all, or they claim to be peer-reviewed and they're not, but the same is true of subscription-based journals. Those problems are not unique to open access journals. And in fact, many open access journals are highly respected. Some of them have very high impact factors. Here's a list of a few that have especially high impact factors. But also keep in mind that many of the most highly respected non-open access journals allow authors to self-archive in repositories. In other words, they're green open access journals, and I'll go back to green in a minute. So of course, impact factor isn't really equally relevant to all disciplines. I don't want people to get caught up in the specifics of metrics, but this was just one example to show that according to some traditional metrics, there are a large number of journals that are ranked right up there with the closed open access journals, and I think I think it's PLOS Biology that is now the top ranked one, and Atmospheric Chemistry and Physics is also top ranked in its field. So it's not just that it's become a respectable journal. They are the top journals in their field. So if you're interested in Gold Open Access, take a look at the Directory of Open Access Journals. It's exactly what it sounds like. A browsable and searchable database of information about journals that are entirely open access. And there are a lot. As of right now, there are over 9,900 journals, getting very, very close to 10,000. So business models. Producing a journal isn't free. It really does cost time and money. So if the articles are free to read, how do the journals cover their costs? What are the economics of open access journals? And so as you can see in this bulleted list, there are many different ways, ranging from volunteers to advertising to selling print editions to endowments to charging publication fees. Many, many different business models. Sometimes they use a combination of those tactics to cover a journal's costs. Ooh, you might have noticed that I just said publication fees. So yes, some open access journals do charge publication fees. Some don't. But remember that even some subscription-based journals charge publication fees. Some subscription-based journals, they rake in the money from the subscriptions, but they still say to you, if you want images, you, the author, you've got to pay for it. If you want color images, you, the author, have got to pay for it. If you're going to cross a certain number of pages, you, the author, have to pay for it. So these fees are nothing new in the world of publishing. And I've had some people tell me that they went with the open access journal because the open access journal's fee was lower than they would have paid in the subscription-based journal. Despite that, people often get upset about the existence of fees, so this is really important. Fees are not necessarily paid from researchers' pockets. Ideally, they would never be paid from researchers' pockets. Some institutions pay fees for their employees. Grants can be used to pay publication fees, and some journals, generally the most respected open access journals, waive fees for those who do not have funding for them. There's even a movement where some institutions will happily pay a journal's publication fee, but this is the tricky part. They will pay it only if it's a journal that's willing to waive the fee for others. So those institutions, it includes Cornell and Columbia and a bunch of others, they say we will happily pay the fee, but only for those journals that have practices we support and are willing to waive the fee for those at less wealthy institutions. So it's their way of promoting open access equity and supporting journals with good fee policies. So I really hope that CUNY or individual CUNY campuses will create funds like this in the near future. I have an idea for brewing one up at the Graduate Center, but I hope that we can get something CUNY-wide going soon. But still, some people find publication fees worrisome. They wonder, well, if there's a publication fee, isn't that tantamount to vanity publishing? And the answer is no. At reputable journals, the fact that accepted articles have publication fees has no bearing whatsoever on whether an article is accepted.
How much are those fees typically?
That's a really good question. The highest I've seen is about $3,500 for an article. A lot of them, I know it's not good. A lot of them are in the range of $800, $1,000. PLOS One, which is the biggest open access journal, PLOS One published like 22,000 articles or something like that last year. Their fee is about $1,500, but the PLOS journals are among the ones that are willing to waive the fee if you don't have funding. So I was talking about reputable journals, but what about disreputable journals? It pains me, but they do exist. Wherever there's a chance for profit, there will be people who profiteer, and some open access publishers are what's known as predatory open access publishers. This has been all over the news lately, including the New York Times. But I'm here to tell you that that is not the whole picture of open access publishing. Predatory open access publishers are publishers whose mission is profit, not the dissemination of scholarly information. It's not that they publish scholarship and happen to have fees to cover the necessary expenses. No, it's that they charge fees to make a profit and happen to publish some articles, many of them of questionable quality. According to predatory publisher watchdog Jeffrey Beal, typically each publisher has a large number of journals, with each title having broad coverage. Many titles have little or no content, and many lack editors. Although the publishers purport to have a stringent peer review process, in fact, in many cases, the papers are published upon receipt of the author's fees without an authentic review. So examples of some of these predatory publishers include Academic Journals Incorporated, Academia Publishing, Modern Scientific Press, Scientific Journals International. They all have these very generic or broad or innocuous sounding names. So, worry a little bit when you see a publisher's name that's really broad or non-specific like that. It might sound innocuous, but it is not innocuous. And unfortunately, by having shady practices, these journals put the reputation of open access more generally at risk. So I wish it weren't true, but it is. Not all open access publishers are forces of good. But that doesn't mean they're all bad. As I said earlier, we just need to be sure to evaluate journals before trusting them or publishing in them. And we must do this for all journals, because low-quality journals are not unique to open access publishing. There are no shorthands. Open access is not shorthand for high-quality publishing. Open access is not shorthand for low-quality publishing. The same is true for subscription-based journals. So luckily, there's an organization called OASPA, or the Open Access Scholarly Publishers Association. They are an industry association that exists to, among other things, exchange information about open access, promote best practices, advance workable business models, and set ethical standards. And they have a code of conduct. It requires members to practice transparency about their fees and licensing, and it forbids spamming and other activities that could, quote, bring open access publishing into disrepute. So they endeavor to keep out the predatory publishers, and the predators I described a minute ago have not been approved as members of OASPA. There's been some criticism that OASPA is not stringent enough in their requirements, but be that as it may, we should all be really glad that there is an organization endeavoring to separate the predatory publishers from the honest open access publishers. I just want to say it again, bad open access does not invalidate all open access. It does not mean that there's a problem with the open access journal model. As Michael Eisen, a Berkeley professor and Public Library of Science co-founder, says, to suggest that the problem with scientific publishing is that open access enables internet scamming is like saying that the problem with the international finance system is that it enables Nigerian wire transfer scams. He goes on, there are deep problems with science publishing, but the way to fix that is not to curtail open access publishing, it is to fix peer review. He goes on to say, first and foremost, we need to get past the antiquated idea that the singular act of publication, or publication in a particular journal, should signal for all eternity that a paper is valid, let alone important. Even when people take peer review seriously, it still just represents the views of 2 or 3 people at a fixed point in time. To invest the judgment of these people with so much meaning is nuts. And it's far worse when the process is distorted, as it so often is, by the desire to publish sexy papers, or to publish more papers, or because the wrong reviewers were selected, or because we're just too busy to do a good job. If we had, instead, a system where the review process was transparent and persisted for the useful life of a work, none of the flaws exposed in a recent sting operation would matter. So, as I said before, openness is completely independent of the quality or rigor of that journal. And to make that point really clear, I made a nice little Cartesian plane. There are 4 quadrants. If the x-axis is the spectrum of openness and the y-axis is the spectrum of quality or rigor, and there are journals in all 4 quadrants. So yes, there are the super tippy-top journals that are subscription-based, and the super tippy-top journals that are open access. And then there are the predatory open access journals, but there's also the really, really crappy bottom of the barrel subscription-based journals. So as I said before, we must carefully evaluate all journals, print or electronic, subscription or open access. So the takeaway about gold open access is don't let the predatory publishers scare you off. Open access is a viable and sustainable publishing model. Some journals are better than others, but the model is sound. Traditional, highly profitable scholarly journal publishing is restrictive, expensive, outmoded, exploitative, and unnecessary. Open access journals, on the other hand, are generally reader-friendly, author-friendly, and it is publication in the truest sense. It makes work public. It's worth mentioning this sort of middle ground of hybrid journals. They're journals that are subscription-based and give authors the option to pay a fee to make their individual articles open access. Taylor and Francis has a program called Open Select. Springer has a program called Open Choice. So what this means is that in a given issue, there can be a combination of open access and non-open access articles. For some publishers, unfortunately, this amounts to double dipping. They get paid the publication fees for the articles that are going to become open access, and then they still get the subscription fees from all of the people in the libraries that subscribe to the journals. However, some journals are a little more on the up and up, and they lower the subscription price depending on how many authors pay to go open access. So it's hard to know if it's really done fairly, but that is promising potentially as a way to transition from subscription-based journals to open access. Okay, So that was my big spiel about the open access journals. Let's switch now to green open access, which personally I think is, I won't say more important, but more feasible by many of us at CUNY. Green open access refers to works that, regardless of where else they appear, are made available online in a repository committed to long-term preservation. Then putting one's own work into an open access repository is called self-archiving. Okay, suppose you want to do that. Where can you self-archive? One place to self-archive is in a subject repository or a repository dedicated to one or more fields of study. Some of the biggest ones are archive.org for physics, math, computer science, some other sciences, PubMed Central for the biomedical sciences, REPEC for economics, SSRN for the social sciences, and for the librarians in the room, there's one called ELIS. If you go to my slideshow, there's a link to a much, much, much longer list of all the disciplinary repositories. But we have to point out that not every field has a subject repository. And also subject repositories, a lot of them accept only articles. So if there are other things you'd like to put in there, like conference posters or conference presentations, you can't. So in many ways, what's preferable are institutional repositories. And those are online databases offered by an institution to collect, preserve, and make freely available scholarly journal articles and other works created by that institution's community. Of course, self-archiving in an institutional repository is possible only at institutions with a repository. Since we have at least two administrators in the room, I will trot out the quote that I like to give to administrators, which is that open access institutional repositories can, quote, serve as tangible indicators of a university's quality and demonstrate the scientific, societal, and economic relevance of its research activities, thus increasing the institution's visibility, status, and public value. So, who has an institutional repository? A ton of colleges. MIT, Harvard, University of California, and hundreds others. In fact, there's a whole directory of open access repositories. And the schools that have them range from public to private, tiny to huge. Every year that goes by, more and more universities have institutional repositories. But who doesn't? CUNY. So we have a problem. Where can people from CUNY, whose fields do not have a subject repository, where can they self-archive their work? And the answer is that CUNY needs an institutional repository. Luckily, we're working on it. Here at the Graduate Center, we're going to be launching one quite soon, just for the Graduate Center community. And when I say that, I mean just the Graduate Center community can upload to it, but then the world will be able to look at everything in there. And then we really hope, we're working on it really hard, funding is the only question, that we can then expand that to all of CUNY pretty soon. So, suppose you're interested in self-archiving. How can you find out if a journal is green open access? Well, you can track down their copyright transfer agreement and try to make sense of it, which is not always easy. Here's a typical one. And note that this is just half of the copyright transfer agreement. They're really hard to make sense of. But luckily, there is an easier method. There's a tool called Sherpa Romeo, which summarizes journals' policies about copyright and self-archiving in a really easy to understand way. So if you really want to know the nitty-gritty of a policy, it's good to track down that. But if you're trying to get a sense of what the journals allow more generally, Sherpa Romeo is a really useful tool. So let's look at a few examples. Here is the record for the Journal of Symbolic Logic, and you'll see these 3 green check marks. And what they mean, the first one means that the author's preprint, or the pre-peer-reviewed version, can be self-archived. How crazy is it that some journals wouldn't allow you to do that? You know, that's the version of the article before the journals even touched it. And some journals don't allow you to do that. But the second green check mark is the author's postprint, or the post-peer-reviewed version. It's still like the Word document, no special formatting, but it's the post-peer-reviewed version. And then this journal also allows you to self-archive the final publisher's formatted PDF. Some journals allow that, some journals don't. Some journals say, no, we added value when we created that final formatted PDF. We want to maintain control over that. That's a reasonable stance. And some say, well, we really want to make sure that whenever we're represented online, we're represented as professionally looking as possible. So yes, please post that. And that's also a reasonable stance. Here's another journal where they say, sure, you can self-archive the preprint. Sure, you can self-archive the postprint, but we'd like to maintain control over the final PDF. I think that's fine too. You know, the thing we care about is the content. As long as the content's available, it doesn't really matter if it's in, you know, pretty 2 columns or not. The only problem when you can't self-archive the final PDF is that sometimes the readers can't tell what version it is. Here's one that allows you to self-archive the preprint, but nothing else. It's okay. And then here's one. This is my favorite. They allow you to do nothing. And in fact, all you are allowed to do is post a summary of the abstract. You can't even post the abstract. You can only post an abstract of the abstract. Okay, so we've seen a wide range of permissions, but what's really going on? What are the trends? So, of the over 18,000 journals covered by Sherpa Romeo as of November 2011, which is the most recent data I can find, 87% allow immediate self-archiving of some version of the article. I bet most of us never knew that because people don't really bother to read those copyright agreements that carefully. 60% allow immediate self-archiving of the post-refereed version of the article, including 16% that allow immediate self-archiving of the published PDF. Some journals only allow self-archiving after an embargo period, which is usually 6 months to 24 months, and what those embargo periods say is, okay, you can self-archive, you can make it open access, but give us a head start. So allowing for the embargoes, 94% of journals allow some form of self-archiving of the post-refereed versions. So that's a lot of journals that allow self-archiving of some kind or another. Judging by these numbers, a huge percentage of CUNY scholarship could be made freely available online if only researchers, 1, knew about their rights, 2, had a place to put their articles, and 3, exercised their rights to put them there. So we're working on all 3 of these things. I'm here talking to you. I talk to people all the time about these rights. We're working on creating an institutional repository, and then we're going to work on policies that encourage people to put things there. So, and why wouldn't authors want to make their articles freely available online? After all, it's not like any of the money that the publisher makes is shared with the authors. So the authors aren't going to be losing any money or anything like that by making it freely available online. In fact, often their careers stand to benefit by making it online. So what if you want to publish in a journal that's too restrictive for your tastes? Can you negotiate? If you don't like the terms of the policy, you can try, and you don't have to start from scratch. There is something called the Scholars Copyright Addendum Engine. And so you can use it to generate an addendum with all the appropriate legal language and then attach the addendum to their copyright transfer agreement. Not all publishers accept it, but a lot of them do. And if you want to give it a try, it's better to work with something that's established and they're used to seeing than trying to write up something from scratch, which probably wouldn't pass muster. My advice to authors: research any journal or publisher you're considering. What's the quality? What's the peer reviewing process? What's the copyright policy? If you have the right to self-archive, exercise that right. If you don't have that right, request it. I'm not going to tell anybody what to do. Choose the best publishing venue for you and your career, but also think about the system you're contributing to and the system you want to contribute to. And so you should always seek to know your rights about what you write. So who thinks open access is important? This is my attempt to convince you that it's a good thing by name dropping. Here are some institutions that actively support open access. Open access policies have been approved at a number of private and public colleges and universities, including MIT, Harvard, Princeton, University of Kansas, Utah State, and a bunch of others. And what their policies say is that unless faculty request a waiver, they automatically grant the university a non-exclusive license to their articles, which gives the university the right to make those articles available open access on their institutional repository. So in other words, what those institutions are doing is throwing their weight behind the individual authors in their dealings with their publishers, saying that they don't want, in fact, they don't allow the publishers to take away all of their faculty members' rights. So the non-exclusive license is given to the university before any dealings with the journal happened. So by the time you're signing something with the journal, you've already given a license to the university. The journal can't prevent you from doing it. Of course, if the publisher doesn't want to play along with this, they can opt out. All of these policies have opt-out clauses. Also, several grant funding agencies have open access mandates. So, for example, the National Institutes of Health has an open access mandate. This is why that teenager could create the new test for pancreatic cancer. What the NIH mandate says is that if you receive funding from NIH and you produce articles based on your research, it must become open access within a year. They fund, when the government is not shut down, They fund something on the order of $30 billion of research a year, and that results in 70 to 80,000 journal articles a year. So with up to a year delay, that is an incredible number of journals becoming open access every year. So there are a bunch of other funding agencies that have similar mandates: the Gates Foundation, the MacArthur Foundation, the Wellcome Trust, the Research Councils UK. Though it's interesting, the Research Council's mandate favors gold open access in this weird way. The publishers sort of got to them and said, and convinced them to favor gold, which of course allows the publishers to continue raking in fees. So people are hoping that the Research Council's mandate will be tweaked, but there's a lot of mandates out there. And some states and countries have open access policies. Ireland has a policy that says anything published with federal funding must be made open access. Illinois has a policy. Illinois' policy is not quite that strong, but it's a law, I shouldn't say it's a policy. Their law says that, I think it says that within the year, all institutions must come up with an open access policy. So they're making all public universities, or all public schools in Illinois, actively grapple with the question. And more federal agencies are coming soon. About a year ago, there was a We the People petition, which you might be familiar with. There are these petitions that you can make to the White House, and if they pass a certain threshold of signatures, you're guaranteed a response. So there was a petition encouraging the government to broaden the NIH mandate. And many, many, many people signed it, and there was a response, and the response was actually surprisingly strong. What there was a directive to all of the other large federal agencies, all the agencies that fund $100 million or more of research per year, to develop policies similar to the NIH's. So they're not in effect yet. They had to turn in their drafts in August, so we should start seeing these policies kick in soon. But so now that NIH mandate is extended to NASA, the NSF, the Department of Defense, Department of Agriculture, the CDC, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. I think it's 19 agencies it includes. Interestingly, it does not include the NEA because there's not enough arts funding to reach that threshold. And really, who could argue with this? You know, taxpayers are entitled to the research they pay for. The only people who would argue against that are the publishers. I mean, I actually kind of think how is this possible that we lived so long without policies like this? So another exciting bit of news, it's quite possible that New York State might have such a policy. There's something called the Taxpayer Access to Publicly Funded Research Act. It would make all state-funded research, which is more than $50 million a year, open access. It was introduced in 2013, but commercial publishers lobbied heavily against it, stirring up confusion and threatening up to 18,000 job losses. And it sowed confusion, and it didn't pass. But there is a lot of hope that it will pass in 2014 when a more formal education campaign can be performed by educational institutions and open access advocates. So, as I said, the arguments for open access are really pretty unassailable. Taxpayers are entitled to the research they fund, so support is spreading. As a result, some publishers are experimenting with new models they know they need to adjust, and some publishers are getting really ugly. And the ugliest of the publishers is the American Chemical Society. One of the editors of one of their publications wrote, meaning open access advocates, their unspoken crusade is to socialize all aspects of science, putting the federal government in charge of funding science, communicating science, and maintaining the archive of scientific knowledge. So clearly he's trying to equate open access with communism. Also, the Association of American Publishers hired a lobbyist to advise them about how to counteract the support for open access. And what that lobbyist advised them was to try to spread the message that public access equals government censorship. Obviously, it makes no sense. But as some people have figured out, if you say something enough to congressmen and on the news, they start to believe it. But maybe these moves by scared publishers are just the last gasps of the traditional commercial publishing system. Maybe open access is just becoming inevitable. David Lewis believes so. He wrote an article in College and Research Libraries called The Inevitability of Open Access, where he argues that sometime between 2020 and 2025, 90% of scholarly articles will be open access. I have to admit, I read the article. I'm not entirely convinced by all of his arguments, but it could well be the case that open access is just becoming inevitable. or even if it's not becoming inevitable, it's growing dramatically. Here are some stats. Here's some stats collected by Heather Morrison on her blog, The Imaginary Journal of Poetic Economics, because what is commercial scholarly publishing if not like totally made up economics? So as of the end of 2012, there were over 8,400 open access journals. We're now up to 9,900. There were over 3,000 open access repositories, and we're now up to 3,500. And there were a whopping 2.6 million open access articles in PubMed Central, and now we're up to 2.8 million. In fact, half of papers published in 2011 are now free to read. It's a major, major milestone. So either they were made open access immediately, or they were made open after an embargo period. So yeah, more would be better, faster would be better, but it's still a huge percentage of articles becoming open access reasonably quickly. And that's why I titled the talk, Which Side Are You On? So which of the halves do you fall into? Are the articles you read among the open access half? What about the articles you write? Are the journals to which you submit open access friendly? What about the journals for which you peer review? A lot of people have decided to really involve themselves and say, no, I will not submit to, edit for, peer review for any journals that are not open access friendly. Can you think of any reasons why the public should not have access to the results of taxpayer-funded research? Does anybody think we should care about the profits of publishers more than we should care about taxpayer access? I'm certainly interested to talk about it. So before we have discussion, just know that our next event in this series is To Catch a Predator, How to Recognize Predatory Journals and Conferences. That's November 15th from 10 to noon, and then in the spring we'll have events on open educational resources and dissertations and open access. Does anybody have anything to say? Questions?